ENR 2100, which is offered at The Ohio State University. The class will be taught by myself, Dr. Brian Lauer, and my brother, Dr. Stephen Lauer. It will be taught at Ohio State University through the School of Environment and Natural Resources. Here we have a gray wolf from Yellowstone National Park, and we have the definition of environment. It's a specific set of physical conditions that would be oxygen, carbon dioxide, incoming electromagnetic radiation, the minerals that are here in the soil, and biological conditions. So that would be the organic molecules that make up this gray wolf, the organic molecules that make up this tree, that make up this grass, the organic molecules in the feces, the microorganisms, those things that are made from carbon and hydrogen. And so you have the interactions between the abiotic, the non-living, and the biotic, the living, for a given time and space. So in this case, we would be talking about gray wolves that live in Yellowstone National Park today. Or you could be talking about gray wolves that lived in British Columbia 200 years ago. And we're going to examine their growth and their development and their reproductive success for life on this planet. We're all part of planet Earth. Planet Earth is essentially an organism, and we're just the various parts of it. So we are all interconnected. The elements that are in myself, that are in you, that are in this wolf, they're all the same. The DNA, the RNA, the lipids, the proteins, all of this material is interwoven. When we pass on and die, this material will be broken down by microorganisms, and some other living organism will recycle that nitrogen, that carbon, that phosphorus, and turn it into a new living organism 100, 1,000, or maybe even 1,000,000 years from now. The physical environment is shown right here. It's H2O, water, and this was liquid water. It's just located right here. This is frozen solid water, and the clouds up here would be the gaseous vapor water. Water is not living. It's inorganic. 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen atom make up this molecule. About 60% of yourself is water. So that is one of the abiotic physical components that is very, very important for life on this planet. Air, such as oxygen, such as carbon dioxide, such as nitrogen gas, all of these are very important as well. And finally, the soil. Very important what goes on in the soil. There's iron, there's manganese in there, these trace elements that we need for life. All of this is within the living system of Earth, and that's why we've evolved on this planet today. The biological components are those components that consist of organic molecules. An organic molecule is any molecule that has carbon bonded to hydrogen. So you are organic because you have a lot of amino acids, DNA, RNA, lipids, sugars that consist of carbon and hydrogen bonds. So all the microorganisms, viruses, plants, animals, they have carbon-hydrogen bonds, and so they are the organic parts of Earth itself. So it's the interplay between these organic biomolecules and organisms and these inorganic, abiotic, physical components, these things playing together make Earth, make life that we have on this planet today. Environmental science itself is an interdisciplinary study between humans' relationship with the other organisms and parts of Earth. There's many different disciplines: biology, geography, chemistry, geology, physics. We'll do a little bit of economics, sociology, anthropology, resource management, agriculture, law, policies, engineering, and ethics. And we will touch base with all of these throughout the entire semester and how they feed into these relationships between different organisms and humans in this abiotic world that we call Earth. How did we get to where we are today on planet Earth? And this figure here really shows how we went from the Big Bang to where we are today. And this is the history of the universe if we compressed it into 1 year. The universe itself is about 13.7 billion years old. And for me, that's a little hard to get a grasp on. But what I do have a very good grasp on, and what I think most of you do, is a calendar year. From January all the way to December 31st at 11:59 p.m., right before you're going to kiss your significant other at the ring of midnight. And this is what we have shown here for the universe. On January 1, at that first second, we had the Big Bang, and that was the origin of our universe. Everything that we know today in our universe. Now, there may be other universes out there. We don't know if that's the case, but on January 1st, 13.7 billion years ago, we had our universe being born. Our Milky Way galaxy took until about the end of February to come into being, and this is where you and I will most likely spend the rest of our life and probably billions of years after that. We have to come clear down here to September. And in September, which corresponds to about 4.6 billion years ago, we have the origin of our solar system. Shortly after that, about 100 million years after that, we have Earth itself, which is about 4.5 billion years old. And then finally, at the end of September, we have the earliest types of life on planet Earth. We call these prokaryotic organisms. These are organisms that lack a nucleus. They are very simple organisms, and the ones that we see out there today, the bacteria that you see out there today, the bacteria that may have made you sick last winter, these are all prokaryotic organisms. They started about 3.5 billion years ago. Up until this point, there's no oxygen on planet Earth. So these organisms were anaerobic. These are organisms that tolerate conditions without oxygen. In fact, for many of them, oxygen is toxic. So these are all organisms. Up through here, there's no oxygen on our planet. So these are the earliest types of life forms. In October, we begin to have photosynthesis. So many of these microorganisms will begin to trap the sun's energy and convert it into sugar, to convert it into chemical energy. This would be very similar to the cyanobacteria, the algae that you have in freshwater lakes, streams, and ponds today in the summertime. We come back down here to November, and we have finally eukaryotic life forms. You and I are a eukaryotic life form. We are organisms that have DNA, and our DNA is wrapped inside a protective nucleus, and that's what a eukaryotic life form is. Again, there's no oxygen yet on this planet. All of these life forms are anaerobic organisms. They've evolved to live in conditions where there's no oxygen. Finally, around December 1st, we have an oxygenated atmosphere. These organisms up here through photosynthesis have produced enough oxygen, they've released it up into the atmosphere, that we now have somewhere around 20% oxygen concentrations, and so now we can have organisms that are just like you and I. We use oxygen as our terminal electron acceptors when we generate energy, and we can now have these organisms start to evolve. So if we break down December into its days, December 1 to December 31st, that's what we're shown right here. And you can see on December 19th, we have land plants. On December 23rd, reptiles on our planet. On Christmas Day, dinosaurs. The day after Christmas, we finally have mammals, organisms just like you and I. The 28th, we have flowering organisms. And you'll notice in this entire period, there's no humans. We still don't have humans on planet Earth. And here we are near the end of December. It's almost the new year, and we don't have any humans. We don't have civilization. We don't have speech. We don't have culture on our planet. You have to come clear down here to the last few hours of the last day of this year. And that's what this blue box is here, from about 8 p.m. till 11:59 p.m., right before the stroke of midnight. That's when we begin to see the earliest human life forms on our planet. At about 9 p.m., we have Australopithecus. These are early hominids. Lucy and Artie are very good examples, and you're going to have an assignment on Lucy and Artie. They're at about 9 p.m. Homo erectus, our ancestor, is about 2 million years ago. That's at about 10 p.m. Homo sapiens, you and I, our species, is about right at the stroke of midnight. And finally, human civilization is right before it strokes midnight into the new year. Human civilization itself is about the last 40 seconds of the year, and your lifespan is about 0.20 seconds. So you can see how insignificant we are as humans. We like to think of ourselves as the center of the universe, but you can see here that we're not the center of anything. In fact, we're lucky just to be alive, because we've went through the entire calendar year, and just in the last few seconds of that calendar year, you and I have come into being, and all other humans on the planet. On this scale, 1 second equals approximately 435 years. Here's a free video from Public Broadcasting, PBS Frontline. And if you haven't checked out PBS, I encourage you to do so. Your tax money is paying for this. They have a lot of excellent programs, from Nature to Nova to Frontline, that explain the world around you. I'd like you to watch Chapter 1, Watching the World Change. And this is a very good introduction into what we'll be discussing in class. And that is how we interact as humans with Earth, how we've impacted the Earth, mainly in a negative way, but we'll also provide some insightful stories that show how we can do some good things for the world themselves. This program was written and produced by Martin Smith, who is a reporter for PBS Frontline. It's a 2-hour program that first aired right before the presidential elections that elected President Barack Obama in 2008, and it investigates humans' role in climate changes. One of the interesting points of this video is that one of our professors from Ohio State University, Dr. Lonnie Thompson, provides a lot of insight into this video as he talks about his research on the glaciers around the world and how they are disappearing because of climate change. So I'd like you to watch from 3 minutes to 11 minutes, and we're going to watch many sections of this video throughout the year, so you're welcome to watch the entire 2-hour program. But right now, we'd like you to watch about the first 11 minutes of the video.
We're standing at the precipice of hell. If everybody else was to live like an American, then the planet is doomed.
This fall, as the election heats up, Frontline focuses its lens on what is probably the most urgent problem facing the next president.
The United States government as a whole doesn't get this yet. We have to mobilize ourselves to the scale of this issue.
In a 2-hour special report, Frontline correspondent Martin Smith travels the planet to take the measure of the most important issue of our time.
By the year 2050, we need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the United States between 60 and 80%.
It's an unaccomplishable goal.
Simple as that.
Just that simple.
It is an investigation into the politics.
It's as if Tony Soprano had a seat in the Senate.
We can't get rid of the coal industry or dial it out, as Albert Gore says. If the coal industry were eliminated, this country would go black.
A report on big business.
The automobile companies are the single biggest obstacle to real progress in fuel economy.
Why did Toyota beat you to the Prius?
Toyota looked at the hybrid from an overall standpoint, and General Motors really looked at, can this vehicle make money?
But yet, Toyota is eating your lunch.
The thought of green is nice, but when people flip the switch, they want the lights to come on.
And an examination of the hard choices that lie ahead for the country and the world.
If we don't do something about reducing CO2 emissions, we're going to cook the planet.
We virtually need to transform everything that we do today. We can have growth, we can have wealth without the pain of pollution.
From deep within the earth to the rooftop of the world, the crowded streets of India and China, to the halls of business and the corridors of power. Frontline examines what's being done and how much more we have yet to do.
We seem incapable of grasping what's at stake here. And perhaps it's because so much is at stake. Addressing this really means reinventing the engine of our lives, which is fossil fuels.
There has got to be a way. Burning down the house.
Heat, a Frontline global investigation. Watch online or on air beginning October 21st.
A lot of challenges we face each day, challenges that we as humans have made ourselves. And these challenges are what we're going to be looking at throughout the semester. We're going to be looking a lot at energy production and its effect on the surrounding ecosystems and climate change. In my opinion, the production of energy is probably the #1 environmental issue that we face today and that future generations will face. How are we going to get the energy that we need to turn on the lights, that we need to fly our planes, drive our cars, to drive the economy, while at the same time not negatively impacting the surrounding environment? We're going to look at food production, which is an essential component for human life on planet Earth. We'll look at air pollution, water quality and quantity, especially freshwater resources, because that's what 99.9% of terrestrial organisms like humans require. We will look at ecosystems, how we can conserve them, how we can preserve them for future generations. We'll look at mining practices for coal, oil, natural gas, and the minerals that you and I are using right now in your computers. There are precious metals that have had to been mined. And when you mine these materials, you're going to destroy and disturb the ecosystem and cause things like water pollution and air pollution. And we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about hazardous waste. What do we do with it? Do we have a very good plan? It turns out that many types of hazardous waste, we as humans do not have a good plan on how to handle this, and that's really impacting the surrounding ecosystems in a negative manner. We're going to talk about human population and growth. Right now we're at about 7.1 billion people. We're continuing to grow. We'll continue to grow. In your lifetime, we'll probably reach perhaps 13 billion people in your lifetime, and so this is going to have dramatic impacts on Earth's ability to provide food, to provide clean, fresh drinking water, and for us not to destroy and pollute the planet. We're going to look at loss of habitat and biodiversity. Good example of this are tropical rainforests. These are very biodiverse places. When we as humans go into these and cut them down for logging, cut them down for slash and burn agriculture, cut them down for sugarcane plantations. We're really destroying that biodiversity that's taken millions of years to develop. We're going to look at urbanization and transportation. Majority of people around planet Earth live in urbanized environments. Most of you probably grew up in urbanized environments. Our future is going to be in cities, in urban areas, and so this is going to play a dramatic role in humanity in the future. And finally, we're going to look at environmental inequality and justice. Why does it seem that the poor people that can't represent themselves, that are less educated, that have less social class, why are these the ones that are exposed to a disproportionate amount of pollution? Why do we let that occur? And is there anything that we can do to make that better for these people? So you can see we're mainly going to talk about the physical, biological parts of environmental science, but we're also going to get into some of the social and cultural and legal aspects when we examine pollution and how it affects different populations of people around the world. Perhaps the most important thing that I hope you get out of this class is the development of environmental and scientific literacy. Being able to understand what a good, reputable source of information is, such as a journal article, and this is where I hope that you get your information now in the future for things like climate change, for things like energy production. And when you compare that to tertiary sources, such as a website or a blog or some magazine that's not peer-reviewed, this information is not going to be reliable, and this is not the information that you should be used to making your decisions that are going to affect yourself, your children, and other people around you. We're going to look at how humans are an environmental force that impacts the ecosystem. We can do some very bad things to the land, to the water, to the air. Carrying capacity, that by definition is the size of population that an area can support indefinitely. And many scientists believe that we've already, as humans, went over that carrying capacity on planet Earth. Ecological footprint, that's the land that you need to provide the resources, the water, the land for agriculture, the land for building shelters and houses and schools and all of these things, and the land to assimilate and take back that waste that we produce. We're also going to talk about anthropogenic sources of pollution, anthropogenic footprints, anything that's caused by or related to human activity is anthropogenic. So this would be anthropogenic air pollution here. This is anthropogenic waste here. This is an urbanized environment. This is an anthropogenic environment here. This is anthropogenic waste as well. When we talk about ecological footprint, the United States, unfortunately, is #1 in this area. Ecological footprint for one person living in the United States is about 100,000 meters squared. Our population is approximately 320 million people, and our land mass is about 9,250,000 square kilometers. If we compare this to another large nation, a powerful nation that has a great economy, has a massive population, a big anthropogenic footprint, is China. China's ecological footprint is a lot smaller than the ecological footprint for an average person living in the United States. One person in China, ecological footprint is only 10,000 square meters. The land of China is approximately the same, 9,250,000. The population is about 4 times greater at 1,400,000,000 people. So again, the ecological footprint is how much land, how much resources do you need to support your lifestyle. And you can see we in the United States, to live the way we do, require much, much greater land. In China, they have got by with a much smaller ecological footprint. So if you do the math of 100,000 square meters per person times the population of the United States, which is about 320 million people, you will determine that the United States as a whole has an ecological footprint of about 32 million square kilometers. Now, unfortunately, our land mass is only 9,250,000 kilometers squared. And so you can see, this is a lot bigger number than this number here. And so we need approximately 3.5 United States to provide the resources, to provide all the raw materials that we use in our daily lives. China, by comparison, if you do the math from the previous page, as a country has an ecological footprint of about 14 million square kilometers. So they require the resources not only from China, but from approximately an area about 50% bigger than China. So both the United States and China consume more land and resources than we have contained in our natural borders. You can see that the United States consumes a lot more of these resources, and that's troubling when you consider that the population of China is 4 times greater than the population of the United States. So hooray, the United States is number 1 in consuming these. That's not such a great thing when you look at the anthropogenic pollution and disturbances that we're manufacturing as citizens of the United States. If we interpolate this to the other 7.2 billion people living on planet Earth, if every human on our planet lived like we do in the United States, with all the products, with all the freshwater resources, with all the food that we consume, all the waste that we generate, we would need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and about 2/3 Earths to support that. Obviously, we only have one Earth, and so we don't have the capacity to support everybody living like we do here in the United States. And fortunately for us and the planet, most people do not live like we do here in the U.S. If they did, obviously we would be in big trouble right now. By comparison, if every human on planet Earth lived like people do in China, then we would need this much of the Earth to live. Not even a whole planet. So you can see, people in China, larger population, their ecological footprint is much smaller than we have here in the United States. This really contrasts the way that different people impact the world around them, the way that different communities and society and cultures consume resources and produce waste. And it's something that we really need to consider right now when we talk about our sons and daughters and grandchildren and future generations that are going to live on our planet. If we continue to live and other countries become wealthier like China and India and live like we do here in the United States, there's going to be a lot of problems in the future because we don't have the resources to support this capacity and to assimilate and recycle the waste products and materials that we produce. Many scientists and engineers may argue that we have already passed Earth's ability to support the populations of humans that we have on this planet. And that's going to be something that you can decide in the course of this class, and something that we will find in not too distant future, whether or not this is true. We know that there's only one planet Earth out there. There may be millions and millions of other planets out there that have liquid water on the surface, have carbon dioxide and oxygen and nitrogen in the atmosphere, but so far we haven't discovered these planets, and the likelihood that we discover one in our lifetime that we can actually travel to is extremely remote, because those planets that NASA is currently looking at, and we'll talk about here in a little bit later in one of the later lectures, the Kepler Space Telescope is looking for planets that can be inhabited by other humans, organisms. These planets are so far away, many, many light years away, that it's almost impossible, at least with current technology, for us to ever think about reaching these planets. So this is what we have here today, and hopefully by the end of this class I can convince you, if I haven't already, and if you haven't already convinced yourself, that this is a very, very precious planet, and we need to do everything that we can to protect it for future generations, because this is us. This is what we have right now. We are part of the Earth. The Earth is part of us, and as far as we know, we're not going to go off of this planet, and we need to do the best we can to protect our house, to protect our planet. The United Nations Millennium Ecosystem Assessment stated that due to human activity, the ability of Earth's ecosystems to provide for future generations has been gravely imperiled. And you and I have these different ways of looking at these problems. And I don't think each one of you can be defined by one of these people. I think that our moods and our ideas probably change depending on the day, depending on the year, depending on the topic that we're talking about. Some of us have the notion that we have the technology and engineering, we have the intelligence to be able to resolve any problems that we run into. This is a very optimistic view. Some of us want to evaluate and respond and then move forward based on the best available evidence. Some of us have gloom and doom. There's nothing we can do about the problems. We might as well just give up. Hopefully most of you do not have this. Some of us have blinders on, in my opinion, and we have this rosy optimism. Don't worry, it'll all be taken care of. This is kind of the blissful ignorance. Ignorance is bliss. And you've often heard that, and I think that is true. If you don't take the time to understand a complex issue, then you don't have to worry about that issue because you don't understand it in the first place. And finally, the optimism, the frontier look. The resources are here for humanity to use. We'll find future resources whenever we need to. Nature will provide the solutions. So again, I don't think you can fit into any one of these different characters here. I think depending on the story, depending on the issue, we probably kind of move back and forth between these 5 different characteristics. When you think about humanity and you remember back to the evolution of life on Earth, broken down into a calendar year, and you can see that, humanity, we've only been here for a few seconds in the general scheme of things and the universe as a whole. We have, in that short period of time, tapped into almost all of these non-renewable resources, and we've used almost all of them: coal, oil, and gas, natural gas, which is mainly methane. Most likely in your lifetime, we will run out of these 2 here. And in your children's and grandchildren's lifetime, we will probably run out of this resource here. We use these fossil fuels to turn on the lights, to drive our cars, to fly our airplanes, to run our economies. It took hundreds of millions of years for these to form. These are dead and decomposing plants, animals, living material that we're burning to get the resources and energy that we need. It took a very, very long time for this material to be created with pressure, with temperature, underneath the Earth's crust to make that oil, gas, and coal that we can harvest out of the ground, mined out of the ground, and then burn to produce energy. We have used this in about 200 years. So in about the last 100 to 200 years, since the 1800s and the Industrial Revolution, we have consumed what took 300 millions of years. We have consumed that in about 100 years. So this is why we consider this a non-renewable resource. In the next 100 years, when these are all gone, there's not going to be any more. Take 300 million years for this to form. We're not going to be able to wait around for 300 million years in some sort of frozen animation for this material to come back. On the other hand, renewable resources are the resource of the future. Non-renewables, by all intents and purposes, are dying, are dead. They will die. Renewable resources are what future generations are going to have to rely on. This is solar, wind, geothermal. This is here. This has been here for billions of years. The sun itself is billions of years old. It's going to be around for billions of more years. The wind, geothermal, this is going to be here for long, long, long periods of time into the future. And so we have begun to tap into this. Many countries are doing a much better job. For example, Iceland is doing an excellent job of using geothermal to meet up to 90% of their energy needs. Wind power is a resource that we in the United States are now getting on board, and we have thousands and thousands of wind farms all over the United States tapping into this, and many European countries are getting into solar and wind as well, and they're really leading the way. The one problem with using these renewable energy sources is the conversion of energy. In these natural systems, only about 10% of that energy that we capture from the sun is actually passed on to a usable form. And that's the way it is in nature. When we're going to talk about ecosystems and you have a food pyramid, you have a trophic pyramid, and at the bottom you have grasses, above that you have cows, and above that you have humans. Those cows that eat the grass, they're only getting about 10% of that energy. Those humans that eat those cows, they're only consuming about 10% of the energy from the cow. And so each time you move up the food chain, each time you tap into the sun's energy and try to convert that into electrical energy, you're not 100% efficient. In fact, we're pretty inefficient at capturing that energy. And so that's the main problem with renewable, is that right now we're very inefficient at turning 100% of that sun's energy into 100% of electrical output. Another good example of how this is wasted is the old-fashioned light bulbs, the ones that your parents used. If you were to touch them, don't touch them, you're going to get burnt. And that's because these light bulbs, most of the energy is actually converted into heat, into waste. They get extremely hot, and that's the heat that you feel. The compact fluorescent lights are much more efficient. Those are the little squiggly ones that we all use today. There's a lot less heat that's produced, and so you're conserving a lot more energy. So if we can come up with these technological and engineering advancements, we can become much more efficient at using solar, wind, geothermal, hydroelectric to meet the energy needs of future generations, because this is what's going to be here 1,000 years from now. Fossil fuels are going to be gone, and this is what future generations are going to have to rely on. Sustainability is a very, very important concept today that I'm sure you're all aware of. How can we live in a manner that future generations can also enjoy the benefits that we have today? How can we remain diverse and productive for hundreds and thousands of years without negatively impacting the surrounding environment? These are some things that we can do, and some things that I'm sure you are ready to do. Rely on renewable energy sources such as solar, geothermal, wind power. Use materials sustainably. Recycle. Use natural products, natural resources. Minimize the toxins that we release or create into the environment. Have some sort of population control. We cannot continue to grow as a population of humans the way we are today, exponentially. We need to cut down the birth rates. We need to provide good lives and good livelihoods for these people here. We need to provide incentives for keeping this population under control. because if we don't, we're going to introduce problems such as finding enough fresh water resources, finding enough food. We're going to have viruses and bacteria that are going to spread through these urbanized environments in close proximity, and it's going to lead to lives in the future that aren't quite as good as they are today. So we need to begin to consider ways that we can control our population growth so that we have less of a negative impact on the surrounding ecosystems and we can sustain and enjoy the lives that we have today. And finally, depend on the local biodiversity. There's a lot of farmers markets out there today. That wasn't the case when I was growing up. Today, it's in fashion, in vogue, to go to these farmers markets, and in fact, many of these provide organic produce, organic goods, and they have been farmed in a way that does not negatively impact the environment. When we think about the evolution of humanity on planet Earth and how we've changed as societies, we can see that we've had different impacts on the environments from century to century. This video here from the New York Times called An Unfrozen Future looks at one of these ecosystems in Greenland. This is one of the many fjords in Greenland. It's a freshwater resource. You can see that it's a beautiful place to visit. There's a lot of glaciers. It's very pretty. This is sort of a tundra biome up there, boreal forest biome that we'll talk about later. There's lots of beautiful waterfalls. And in fact, if you are interested in going to an ecosystem like this, the School of Environment and Natural Resources at Ohio State University travels to Iceland every other summer. And Iceland has similar type of ecosystem to Greenland. And it's really breathtaking and beautiful to travel to these types of ecosystems. So I hope you watch this video here. I want you to watch it, and it really describes how the cultures and people of this country, of this area, have changed from 100 years ago of whaling and fishing to mining operations that may be able to extract the precious metals that we use in all of our smartphones, all of our laptops, all of our flat screen TVs, all of those cool little gadgets that we all like that make
This is Elizabeth Rosenthal for the New York Times in Greenland. As Greenland's climate is changing, so are its prospects for the future. With glaciers undergoing record melts this summer, traditional industries are at risk. But the receding ice also exposes new opportunities for an island in economic decline.
Just a few years ago, Greenland wasn't as interesting as it is now for the rest of the world. If we are looking at the climate change in the world, of course it's not only positive for us, the changes. It's dangerous for our country if the climate change continues as it does now.
Under this ice sheet lie vast deposits of valuable minerals. Gold, gems, iron, and rare earth metals have been discovered, offering a potential multi-billion-dollar windfall.
So this is the gold zone, starting up in this corner. Mining could become an important part of life in Greenland. During the next couple of years, we are expecting to see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 new mines popping up in Greenland. We are looking forward to make a major discovery on this island.
Here in Narsok in South Greenland, geologists have found some of the world's largest deposits of rare earth metals.
It's exciting to find them in Greenland because right now almost all the world's rare earth production comes from China. So to find a large deposit outside of China is definitely significant.
When we talk about environmental literacy, it's important to understand 3 important concepts that we have to consider when we try to understand and come up with solutions for many of our environmental challenges. One, the environment itself. Two, the economic consequences and how that's going to impact society. And three, the social and cultural, religious implications of these decisions and practices. Some causes that we're going to look at are burning of fossil fuels, deforestation in places like tropical rainforests. This is going to affect the biodiversity. Methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas that comes mainly from agriculture, and our consumption, how we're using the resources for electronics and those things that we consume each day, especially in the United States. Some of the consequences of this, changing in sea levels that are going to impact those communities, some of them very affluent communities along the coastlines as the oceans begin to rise. Habitat loss, species endangerment, spread of tropical diseases. As the climates change, some areas that were experiencing very, very cold winters, like in Ohio for thousands of years, if not hundreds of thousands of years, they have kept tropical diseases like malaria at bay because the mosquitoes that vector these diseases can't survive through the wintertime. As a result, they die off in the wintertime, and we don't have to worry about these tropical diseases. When climate change comes about, these winters become more mild, and so you're going to see these diseases being able to live throughout, these vectors being able to live throughout the winter times, and so these tropical diseases are going to migrate further north, further south, to areas that had in the past not had to worry about them. And finally, agriculture may be worse in some areas, may be better in others because they don't have the consistent precipitation patterns that they had in the past because those have changed with climate change. Some of the trade-offs and possible actions that we can take to help mitigate these changes would be use alternative fuels such as nuclear power or renewable fuels such as wind and solar. Irrigation can increase crop yields, but it can also lead to water shortages like we see in California. That's a serious problem today. Reforestation products can take CO2 out of the atmosphere, increase habitat biodiversity, but as a result, you're going to take that land away from agriculture, so you're not going to be able to provide the food resources that you may have had in the past. And finally, protecting areas that are prone to floods may protect cities and farms, but it may have negative impacts when you put a levee or a dam or some other divider between an ecosystem. You're going to fragment those habitats, fragment those ecosystems, and they may have really negative implications on the reproductive success of an organism such as a jaguar or a Bengal tiger or some other organism that have very large breeding ranges. They need to travel large distances, and when you put a large man-made barrier in the way, these organisms can't act and behave as they naturally do, and so their reproductive success is going to decline dramatically. Several ways, again, that we can adopt more sustainable practices is to rely on renewable energy, to use material in a more sustainable manner, to have population control measures in place so that we limit our impacts on the environment, and again, to depend on local biodiversity rather than shipping products from on the other side of the world, consuming all of those fossil fuels to bring them to you. Use the local resources that you have in your farmer's market. There are three overarching social traps that you will see throughout the semester in all the stories that we talk about. These social traps seem good in the short term, 5 years, 10 years down the road, everything's rosy, everything's great. But in the long term, 50 years, 100 years from now, it's usually not a good thing for future generations. We as humans tend to think in the short term. What's it going to be like next week? What's it going to be like next month, next year? Maybe we go 5 years down, maybe we go 10 years down? Probably not, but we certainly don't think, in terms of decades to centuries. And that's probably what we need to start doing in order to protect Earth for future generations. This is one social trap, which I'm sure you're familiar with. This is called the tragedy of the commons. This is where we have a common resource, such as the land here, that provides the grass that these cows need. And you have four farmers, one here with a yellow band, one with a pink band, one with a red, and one with a blue. And each one of these farmers has one cow. And each of these cows are going to eat the same amount of resources, make the same amount of waste, use the same amount of land, and everything's happy. Maybe one farmer says, look, there's plenty of resources out there. I can make more money if I bring on more cows. So this red farmer brings in 3 more red cows. There's one pink, one yellow, and one blue. The other farmers say, hold on a second. Mr. Red down the street's got 3 cows. I need to have 3 cows. The other farmer, Mrs. Yellow, says, I need to have 3 cows. And so each of them are going to have their own 3 cows. And you can see over time, you've went from a sustainable practice, sustainable in that this can continue to go for centuries, to something system where you're going to have too many cows on this plot of land. They're going to eat all of these resources. They're going to produce too much waste, and this is not going to be a sustainable practice. This occurs anytime you have a shared resource, such as a pasture, such as freshwater resources, such as land, such as oxygen, that's not owned by one person. Individuals, generally in a capitalistic society, a lot of times will try to maximize their own benefits and profits, and in the end, this is going to hurt the resource, hurt the ecosystem, and hurt future generations that are going to try to rely on this type of farming for their livelihoods. Time-delayed social trap, a good example is modern fishing techniques. We have man-made synthetic fibers that don't break down, that don't tear. We have engineered boats that are very effective at catching fish. And so we've encouraged in the 40s, 50s, and 60s and 70s for these fishermen and fisherwomen to catch as many fish as they can. And over time, they continue this practice. More and more fish are taken out. As a result, the reproductive success goes down dramatically. You're removing reproductively mature organisms. They're not able to produce offspring, and so the population is going to go down. And then today, if you look at tuna, if you look at other types of fish in the ocean, you can see that we don't have the numbers that we did one day because we just didn't manage these populations. Again, this is not only good to protect the biodiversity for this ecosystem because it's a natural system that has evolved over billions of years, and so it works very well. And we probably shouldn't mess with that. In addition, if you want to pass your livelihood onto your daughter or your son, you're not going to be able to do that as well if there's no fish. So it's beneficial for the humans, it's beneficial for the organisms if we find ways to maximize the profits here while still preserving the biodiversity down here for future generations of fisherwomen, fishermen, and future generations of cute little fishes and octopus and whales and all these creatures that call the sea home. And finally, the third social trap, what's called the sliding reinforcer. And this really looks at anthropogenic induced evolution. So you're all familiar with how evolution occurs. You have a diverse population of insects out there, and those insects that are best suited to live in these conditions are the ones that are going to produce more offspring. These offspring are going to have their traits. These traits are going to be passed on, and this is how evolution occurs. We experience this when we use applications like pesticides. If I'm a farmer and I have corn crops here, these are monocultures of corn. That's how I make my livelihood. I have these grasshoppers that come on the corn, eat the corn. It's not good for my livelihood. I want to get rid of them. So I'll spray them with a pesticide and it will kill the majority of these insects. And I can harvest those crops and make money. I spray the same pesticides month after month, year after year. And what's going to happen is some of these insects, because they're all biodiverse, some of them have genes and genomes that are red, some of them have blue, some of them have white. They have different genes, they have different traits. Some of these are most likely going to be able to evolve and live through this pesticide. And so they're going to develop this natural resistance. It's in their genes. This pesticide doesn't kill the blue grasshoppers because they have a certain gene that makes a certain protein that can break down this pesticide or that can bypass the action of this pesticide. So after you use this pesticide for several years, you're left with a blue population of grasshoppers. Your pesticide doesn't kill these guys anymore, and so they destroy your crops. And this is how evolution occurs. Normally we think of evolution as a natural thing going through changes in nature, but you can see this occur in real-world situations where humans apply the pressure in terms of pesticides and force these organisms to evolve into a species that's no longer impacted by these insecticides. A good example of this is the use of glyphosate or Roundup. You've probably used this at home. It's sold at local stores to kill weeds. It's a very broad spectrum herbicide that kills essentially everything that we spray it on. The way it works is it inhibits the plant's enzymes that are involved in the synthesis of aromatic amino acids. Tyrosine, tryptophan, phenylalanine, these are 3 essential amino acids that we as humans need and also plants need. And Roundup affects this pathway so that these plants can no longer make those amino acids, and it does a very effective job at killing those plants pretty quickly. In the United States, we've been using Roundup for decades, and farmers have been using Roundup. They plant crops that have been engineered to be resistant to Roundup. These crops can make these aromatic amino acids so they are not killed by the application of Roundup. The problem is that many weeds, through evolution over the last few decades, have evolved resistance to Roundup. And so Roundup no longer kills them. This is a nice article from the New York Times, and this is a nice infographic that really shows over the last 20 years where these weeds, these resistant plants that farmers can no longer kill with Roundup, how they've evolved in the different states, particularly in the Midwest. Agriculture is very big for Ohio, and so not being able to manage your farms in a way that you produce soybean, that you produce corn, and not produce weeds is a very important economic driver for Ohio. And these two articles look at perhaps our overuse of some of these herbicides, things that we're doing as farmers today, things that companies like Monsanto are doing to try and develop new types of products in corn and soybean that can resist different types of chemicals, and we could perhaps use these chemicals to kill the weeds as a result. So this is a very good example of how Roundup 20 years ago was golden, it was great. Today it's not as effective, and again, that's because life on planet is always evolving. That's what makes it so exciting. So when we kill off one organism with a chemical, some of those are probably going to live through there, pass on their super gene powers to future generation, and that makes it extremely difficult. Another example of this is antibiotic-resistant bacteria. When we use things like penicillin for decades and decades and decades, There are organisms that will live through those treatments. These are the superbugs that are then going to pass their super genes to other organisms, to other offspring, and so we're left behind with antibiotic-resistant bacteria today that we have to, as a society, have to come up with new ways to fight these diseases. The two main obstacles to sustainability, to living in a manner that protects biodiversity, that protects the ecosystem, that protects it for future generations of humans. There's two main obstacles. The first one is education or lack thereof education. A lot of terms, I don't just mean that these people are ignorant, I mean that they make decisions that are very short-sighted. We run businesses, we think of meeting deadlines, meeting objectives every 3 months, meeting the bottom line, and so we have this very short-term view of the world. We get these short-term gains, and we often do not consider the long-term implications. And finally, the distribution of wealth. 20% of the world's population controls 80% of the Earth's resources. And it's this inequality, this rich population is making decisions that are impacting the vast majority of the rest of the population because we need and want these resources, and that causes a lot of problems in terms of environmental issues and sustainability. This map here actually shows the poorer nations around the world. Many of these nations have the resources that we need, and that countries like the United States, China, India, Australia, Germany, Brazil, Canada, we are the wealthier populations, and we go in there and extract a lot of these resources. The percentage of the population that lives less than $2 a day, you can see that here in the United States, that's not the case. Less than 2% of Canada, the United States, do we have those very, very poor people. The same for Russia, for Europe, for China, and for Australia. If you look at South America, if you look at places like India, if you look at Southern Asia and the islands here in Indonesia and the Philippines, Papua New Guinea, if you look over here in many of the African countries, you can see that you have upwards of 80% of that population is living on less than $2 a day. And this is what I mean by that wealth inequality. The decisions that we make here in the United States to bring in coffee from many of these places here, to bring in coffee from here, to bring in mining resources, gold and other things from other countries, in a way and in reality probably is not very fair to people living in these countries. And we have many of these short-term gains and objectives to gaining these resources, and we probably need to start thinking about the longer-term costs of the decisions we're making today. We in the United States, in our history as a nation, in terms of environmental science and our impact on the environment, have 4 main time periods: expansion, resource management, pollution controls, and international efforts. Early on as a nation, Thomas Jefferson and the leaders at the time wanted people to expand to the west, to take over as much land as we could. And the Homestead Act was signed in the 1860s by Abraham Lincoln, and it gave 160 acres to any citizen that could establish a farm in the western part of the United States. And so this was our expansion area. We basically, as a nation, made decisions to harvest as much of the resources as we could, to spread out and take up as much of that land as we could, to farm, to cut down forests, to take advantage of those natural resources. Then, in the late 1800s and through the 1900s, we began to think that perhaps we should start to conserve and save many of these resources. In 1872, the same year that Ohio State became a university and an institution, we had Yellowstone National Park, which was established in Wyoming and Montana. We had the establishment of Yosemite National Park. We're going to talk about Yellowstone. We're going to talk about Glacier National Park. We're going to talk about many of our national forests and parks. I encourage you guys to travel there in the summertime. They're beautiful places to visit. They've been set aside by previous generations for you and for myself to enjoy. They're great places to spend time. In the 1950s, the mid-1900s, we began to switch to a time period where we began to get concerned about pollution. The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, was passed by Congress in the 1970s. Rachel Carson's important book, Silent Spring, was published in 1962, and it looked at the impacts of DDT on bird populations. Silent Spring, the name comes from the fact that the springs were silent from the lack of songbirds. In the 1980s, Superfund sites were established to help clean up some of the worst polluters, some of the most destroyed ecosystems. And your tax dollars help support all of these. And the tax dollars of your parents and grandparents have supported those. And finally, more recently, we've went into international efforts. And so we have, with the Montreal Protocol, reduced chlorofluorocarbons, which caused the hole in the ozone layer. With the Kyoto Protocol in the late 90s, we began to think about greenhouse gas emissions. And today, we as major countries in Europe, in the United States, in China, and India are beginning to understand that the things that we do in the United States affects what happens in China. Things that China do and does affects what happens in the United States. Air pollution, water pollution travels all over the globe. Climate change is going to impact us all equally as a country and as an earth itself. And so we need to find ways that we can work together as countries to get solutions to many of these issues and problems. Humans have different views of the world. There's over 7 billion of us. Each of us have a different view of how we fit into Earth, how we fit into the universe. Some of us have this anthropocentric view, which is a human-centered view, that the resources are here to meet the needs and wants of humans. Some of us have the biocentric view that all life is equally important, whether it's an animal, whether it's a plant, whether it's a human, whether it's a bird, a reptile, a fish, or a microorganism. They all have rights, and we should do our best to protect the rights. And finally, this ecocentric view. Value is given to the ecosystem as a whole. The physical, non-living parts, like the water and the glaciers and the air, as well as the living components like the elk and the bear and the fish and the bison and the trees and the grass. And the idea of this ecocentric view is that this whole thing functions as a system, and we need to protect all the parts of this system. They're interconnected in time and space, soil, species, air, rock, water. All of these things have an invested interest in future generations. We need to protect these things. We need to protect their cycles, like the water cycle, like the carbon cycle, like the nitrogen cycle, because they have evolved on planet Earth for billions of years. They function very well together. It's going right, and we as humans probably shouldn't muck around with it. The ecocentric view views the ecosystem as the most important part of Earth. An ecosystem itself, by definition, is a community of organisms and the surrounding physical environment. So organisms are you and I, bacteria, plants, animals. We're organic. We have carbon and we have hydrogen. So carbon and hydrogen, those components of the ecosystem that have this type of chemical architecture are organic. They're biotic. Abiotic parts are oxygen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide. These are very important, water. These are very important to life on these planets, but they don't have the carbon-hydrogen bond. These are abiotic, inorganic compounds. Biotic parts are plants, animals, humans, anything that has this organic carbon-hydrogen bond. Abiotic would be oxygen, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, water, minerals, sunlight. These are all abiotic components. So an ecosystem can be broken down into simpler parts. Here we have Australia. And this part of Australia, if we zoom in, we have an ecosystem. We have a community of living organisms. We have abiotic components in atmosphere and water, in sunlight, in soil, and these are living together in a specific ecosystem. The community is the organic living parts of the ecosystem. So the plants, the koala bear, the parrots, the microorganisms, anything that has carbon-hydrogen bonds are part of the community. Within that, we have population. A population is a group of organisms that can breed together and produce offspring. So this would be a population of birds, of specific species of birds that breed together and have offspring together. And finally, the smallest part of the ecosystem is the individual. This is the single member of this population. So at the bottom we have the single members, the individuals, then we go up to populations, to entire communities, and finally to bringing in the sun, the air, the soils, and into the ecosystem. So this is how we're going to organize different parts of class. We're going to talk about populations. We're going to talk about communities. We're going to talk about abiotic components. We're going to talk about biotic components of these systems. And so you should become comfortable with using these terms because they will be used throughout class. In many parts of this class, we will ask you to find journal articles from well-respected primary and secondary sources. Here are some very good places to start. And I encourage you after class to continue to read the articles and information that are published from these sources. They are extremely well respected. You're probably familiar with many of these: the New York Times, National Geographic, Science, Nature, the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. These are excellent places to start to find very well respected, peer-reviewed articles about the world around you. All of these are also free. As you are students at Ohio State University, you can go through our Ohio State University libraries and you can have free access to all of these articles here. I also encourage you to use this ISI Web of Science to find articles. Again, it's a free resource available through Ohio State. If you're interested in finding out more sources of information, you can follow us on at OSU Enviro on Twitter. And all of the people that I am following on our Twitter account are very respected sources for finding information on anything to do with science, whether it's ecosystems, whether it's evolution, whether it's organisms, whether it's climate change, air pollution, water pollution. These are all very good sources to start. And finally, each year we have an environmental science student symposium. We actually have photographs and articles and abstracts on many of the posters that were presented by our future students, and you can visit our Poster Day website here. It's free, and you can view a lot of the stories that your previous classmates have done for this class. We are taking this class online, but I will invite you to join our annual Environmental Science Student Symposium that's held each November at Ohio Union on the campus of Ohio State University in Columbus. It's a great place to meet friends, students, see some exciting articles, research that's being done in environmental science. In 2015, I believe we're going to be having our symposium on November 21st. It's usually the week right before Thanksgiving. Even though you won't be a student in my class at the time because you'll have finished this class, done very well, you're welcome to join us. It's a poster session. You can come and go throughout the day. It will start usually at 8 a.m. and be done at 4 p.m. Admission is free, and it is at the Ohio Union during the Ohio State-Michigan week, so it's usually an exciting time over there with a lot of different activities to do. The topics that are covered in the posters vary. Obviously, there's a lot on pollution, there's a lot on water, on different types of energy sources, different ways that we impact freshwater resources such as algae blooms in Lake Erie. And this really shows the different topics that are discussed from last year's symposium. And the larger the word, the more often it was used in the title for the poster. So you can see that there was quite a bit of posters on pollution, on population, on water, on marine systems, on energy, on hydraulic fracturing, on different countries around the world, different parts and ecosystems around the world. So it's a very diverse symposium. It's student run. The posters are wonderful. The students do a very good job. There is a nice video that is on YouTube from last year, 2014's event. And if you're interested to learn more, I encourage you to visit the website or to watch the video.